Some of the most boring testimony I've ever read concerned the various typed, handwritten, and photographed documents, and I used to work on telephone rate cases, so I know boring. It took about 2 days to establish that every one of the handwritten notes, the typed documents, and the documents that Chambers produced out of the pumpkin that were being introduced in evidence, each piece of paper that Chambers said he'd received from Hiss was indeed all or part of a real document from the State Department. Sort of, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, in my one hand, in my left hand is a paper that Chambers produced. In my right hand is a document from the files of the State Department. As you can see, this is a copy of that. Everything Chambers produced is a copy of an authentic State Department document or telegram. So, what's in the documents, you ask? People always want to know about that. Let me answer about all the documents Chambers produced, including the ones he said he didn't get from Hiss, just in the interest of completeness. And let me deal with the non-Hiss ones first to get them out of the way. I guess the point is that Chambers produced more than just what he said he got from Hiss. There was, first of all, the roll of camera film that Chambers produced that had been struck by light. It turned out to have been struck by light. Nothing could be gained from that, so forget that one. Then there were the 2 rolls of film on which photographs had been taken in 1938, but the film hadn't been developed when Chambers gave them to the HUAC staffers in the pumpkin patch in 1948. Images were ultimately coaxed from them, and the documents photographed on them were seen to be not from the State Department, but from the Navy. One of those documents is laughably trivial. It gives instructions on how to paint fire extinguishers. I'm sure the KGB in Moscow was thrilled to read that one. Other of these documents from the Navy state technical data about aircraft parts. It may have been in the public domain, may have been secret. Chambers said that these Navy documents he got from a guy named Ward Pigman, who was in the Bureau of Standards and reviewed Navy documents. Pigman totally denied Chambers' accusations. Incidentally, that Chambers produced these silly documents about fire extinguishers indicates to me that there was no frame-up. If I were framing Hiss with stolen government documents, I wouldn't have anything in there about fire extinguishers. I'd have drawings of the atom bomb and notes in FDR's handwriting. Chambers also produced a 4-page handwritten memo by a man named Harry Dexter White, who was in the Treasury Department. I mentioned him once or twice earlier, and he later became an assistant secretary of the Treasury, and sort of famous for being the head of the founder of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. This handwritten memo describes various issues that were hot in the Treasury Department in 1938. A significant number of them concerned Japan. As you'll hear me say about one Hiss document, it's hard to think of why White would write this memo in the normal course of his job, but the Soviet Union might have been very interested to know what were the hot topics in the Treasury Department. Okay, now we get to the documents that were introduced in evidence in the trials, which Chambers said he got from Hiss. There are the 4 pages of handwritten notes, 65 pages of typewriting, which constitute 41 documents. Some of the documents are several pages long. I'm sorry this gets complicated. One of the typewritten documents turned out not to have been typed on the Hiss home typewriter. It was typed on another kind of typewriter, obviously not the Hiss home typewriter. Chambers was not sure who he got it from. It was typed on government issue paper, by the way, so it probably came right from the government. I think it came from the Navy. And then we have the 2 rolls of developed film that were pulled from the pumpkin, which had been developed in 1938. All these came from the State Department. 58 pages constituting 7 documents. Incidentally, each photograph on the document of these 2 rolls was consecutively numbered by the diligent photographer, and the last photo on one roll is numbered 36, and the first photo on the other roll is numbered 37. So presumably all 58 pages on these 2 rolls were made in one picture-taking session and were presumably gotten from one person in the State Department. One person in state gave Chambers all the 58 documents on these 2 rolls. Early on, Chambers said he wasn't sure who he got these from, but ultimately he said he was sure that he got them from Hiss. So we have a total of 126 pages of paper constituting 51 documents. This is what Chambers testified Hiss gave him without authorization after January 1, 1937. So much for the numbers. The documents date between December 31, 1937 and April 1, 1938. A few documents have attachments that date earlier. It would not surprise me if none of the original documents were created in Hiss's office. 98% of them were obviously created elsewhere and were sent to Hiss's boss, who was Assistant Secretary of State Sayre, more for his information than his action. Part of Hiss's job was to read papers that were sent to Sayre and that Sayre didn't have time to read himself. Most of the documents are telegrams to the State Department from American diplomats in Europe or Asia advising Washington about something that's happened here in Europe or Asia or something that someone said. Okay, to the substance at last. Some of the documents directly concern the specialty of the office in which Hiss worked, American trade relations with foreign countries. These documents concern our trade with Germany or Japan, two countries that were of great interest to the Soviet Union in the late 1930s. Concerning Germany in particular, in early 38, Germany was pressing us for more favorable trade relations, and there was a lot of debate about that within the State Department documents. Pardon me, within the State Department. Most of the documents describe recent events in foreign countries, the Spanish Civil War, the Chinese Civil War, Japanese activities in the areas of China that it had conquered or was conquering, especially areas near the Soviet Union. Hitler's takeover of Austria, which occurred in March 1938. Hitler's threats to Czechoslovakia, which he began gobbling up a few months later. And the reactions of European democracies to what Hitler and the Japanese were doing. A significant number of the documents are labeled confidential, and strictly confidential for the secretary. The originals of many of the documents were in secret code, usually the lowest level of secret code, which was called gray. A few documents were not sent to Hiss's office in the normal course of business, but could have gone there informally. And all these documents are on the 2 rolls of film. One final mind-numbing level of detail. These FYI documents were sent to many people all over the State Department, not just Hiss. Some of the bulletins from China or Austria or wherever were made into as many as 40 copies. And especially at the second trial, the Hiss defense plumbed the depths of the fascinating subject of paper flow in the State Department in 1938. How many people got copies of each document? How many people initialed it, showing that they'd read it? Was Alger Hiss one of those people? Whether the copy Chambers produced was the typewritten original or the carbon copy or a mimeograph, which copy went to where Hiss was working, which one went to where other people were working, which documents were attached to others by paperclip or staple, and who had access to the burn room in the archives. I'm sure this put the jury completely to sleep. And later on I'll get to why this might have mattered. Many of the documents, especially the ones about Japan and Germany's military activities and territorial ambitions, to put it more politely, are not directly pertinent to Hiss's job and foreign trade, but would have been of great interest to the Soviet Union in early 1938. I think by then Stalin realized, I'm going to have to fight a war with Hitler in Europe someday, maybe soon, and he would have been intensely curious to know how soon that was going to happen, how soon Hitler was going to gobble up the countries that were still between Germany and Russia. And whether Russia would also have to fight on a second front, whether the Japanese would go farther south into China or would go up into Siberia. One of the 4 documents in Hiss's handwriting I'm going to spend a lot of time on. It's called the Robinson-Reubens telegram, and if there is a smoking gun document in this case, this is it. In the United States, there were 2 members of the Soviet underground, husband and wife. They made false passports. That was their task in the underground. Their real names, although this is always murky, seem to have been Arnold and Ruth E. Kahl. She was a U.S. citizen. He wasn't. He was Latvian. Latvia was a country in those days with a capital named Riga before the Soviet Union gobbled it up in 1940. Chambers knew these 2 in the underground under one of their many false names, Mr. and Mrs. Ewald. Now, they, like Chambers, had not been faithful Stalinists all along, and when in the late 30s Stalin moved his purges to communist parties in other countries, Mr. E. Kahl was summoned to Moscow for consultations, and like an idiot, he went. He and his wife traveled there in late 1937 under false passports. evidently 2 sets of forged passports, one of which identified them by the name of Robinson, Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, and the other Mr. and Mrs. Rubens. That's why what happened next became known as the Robinson-Reubens Affair. Once they arrived in Moscow, the KGB arrested Mr. Ekal and charged him with anti-Soviet or criminal activity of some kind. And Mrs. Ekal went to our embassy and complained and began hanging around hotels where journalists hung out and telling them, you know, my husband, while traveling under the protection of a U.S. passport, appears to have disappeared into the clutches of the Soviet government. And then the Soviets grabbed her, too. One of the top men in our embassy in Moscow, a man named Loy Henderson, was granted an interview with her, just with her. A Red Army officer was in the room during the interview, and Mrs. Ekal professed to be totally happy and not to need any help from our embassy. Please go away. And the incident died. As best we know, Mr. Ekal died in prison years later. Mrs. Ekal was released from prison but was not allowed to leave the Soviet Union, and their children in the United States were visited and told not to make a fuss about what had happened to their parents if they didn't want even more harm to come to them. Charming people, the communists, just like the early Christians, as Professor Lasky and Vice President Wallace told us. Well, all this became an international incident after Mr. Ekal and then Mrs. Ekal were arrested. And it seems to me that our government had to consider 2 questions. The first is, well, we obviously have to make a stink about this. People traveling under U.S. passports have been grabbed by the foreign police, and we have to make a stink. Is it this big or that big? We don't want to go to war, ruin the whole relationship, but we have to do something. How big a stink to make? And second, I imagine the government was just interested to know, who are these people? What's going on here? Not many people went to the Soviet Union in the 30s, and even fewer of them got picked up by the KGB. What the heck is happening here? While this incident was going on, on January 28, 1938, our embassy's man, Henderson, sent a telegram to the Secretary of State in Washington. And here is the telegram written out as it was typed out in Washington after it was decoded. After the address and the opening salutation and that kind of thing, Henderson says to the Secretary of State, have received the following telegram from Mary Martin, widow of Hugh Martin, formerly employed for special work by legation at Riga, that's the capital of Latvia. And Mrs. Martin says, in quotation marks, remember well Rubens while working for Hugh. Be strict if needed. Right Library of Congress, Law Division. I think this means a few things. Mr. Henderson, second guy in our embassy in Moscow, got a telegram from a person named Mary Martin, whose husband Hugh worked with Mr. Ekal in Latvia. And if the special work he did involves spy stuff, perhaps Mr. Ekal was really a double agent working for us while pretending to work for the Russians. And it seems to me that Mrs. Martin is recommending that the United States be strict with the Russians, which could mean either being very tough or, follow the rule book strictly, I don't know. And that more information on these people can be obtained from the Library of Congress Law Division. Government Exhibit number 1 is the same telegram, every word, except the details at the beginning and the end, in the handwriting of Alger Hiss. Tell from Mary Martin, widow of Hugh Martin, formerly employed for special work by legation at Riga. Remember well Rubens while working for Hugh. Be strict if needed. Right Lib Cong Law Div. 2 observations. As Murray Kempton said, I'm sorry, but I can't think of any work-related reason that Alger Hiss would write this out word for word. But number 2, the Soviet Union would be intensely interested to know every word of this telegram, especially the apparent recommendation, be strict. There were some Americans who spied for the Soviet Union because they were naive idealists who wanted to promote international cooperation. But this is apparently if this is what it seems to be, Alger Hiss was just a stool pigeon for the cops. And not just any cops, but Stalin's secret police. No naive idealist. It's unclear whether Chambers passed this note on to the KGB, but Hiss was willing for him to do so, apparently, if you believe Chambers got it from Hiss. And if this document did get passed to the Soviet Union, these two men both had lives on their consciences. By the way, that Chambers knew about this in the 1930s and was not making this all up in 1948 is clear because remember Chambers' late-night chat with Adolf Berle, the Assistant Secretary of State, the day Hitler invaded Poland? In Berle's handwritten notes of that chat, just after his notation about Alger Hiss, he wrote, "When Loy Henderson interviewed Mrs. Rubens, his report immediately went back to Moscow. Who sent it? Such came from Washington." Hiss admitted that he had written this note and the three other handwritten documents, but he said he'd probably thrown them away and Chambers or someone else filched them from his scrap basket when he was out of the office. None of the four documents, however, were crumpled, torn, or smudged. Two of them had at their top printed words, Department of State, Assistant Secretary, and the tops had been torn off. One final matter about the other documents in this case. Do you remember the scene in the Commodore Hotel where Hiss asked Chambers to open his mouth and finally identified him as George Crosley? Prosecutor Murphy had much of the transcript of that scene read to the jury.